from executive session. Up next is item 6A, and that is discussion and action to determine the funding and coordination of the small business grant program for the 2022 budget. So I'll open that up to council, or Peter, if you have anything else you'd like to add, or no? Okay, council, what would be your pleasure?
Well, I guess we determined the legality of the program, correct? So from that standpoint, we can continue moving forward with it as we progressed. Correct? That's your legal opinion? Okay.
With the additions.
Right.
With the additions we've made.
Excuse me, are you gonna talk about making additions? Because that's why we're here.
Yeah, Heather, would you mind just a brief recap on that for us? You probably got the best knowledge on it.
Right, so the additions are a contract that basically requires job retention, that ties the award of the grant to a defined public purpose. And the second big revision is a site improvement checklist that will be used in determining every grant award recipient. So there is consistency in applying awards and ensuring that we are, again, tying it to that public purpose as defined in the application.
Thank you. Go
So
ahead, Chris.
The action, we want to know if we still, what to do with it in the budget, and just so we're clear.
Looking for a motion and a recommendation? Yes, sir.
Well, this has turned out to be an issue. Now that we verified that council was acting appropriately, the grants were legal. First of all, I feel the program was effective and accomplished the goals we set out to do as the council at the time. I do feel there's more work to be done. I don't want to cripple the URA and the controversy and the allocation of the chamber to put the money to the URA. So I'd make a motion to remove that $85,000 from the allocation of the budget to the URA.
And do what with it?
I haven't gotten there yet.
Okay, sorry.
Well, I'll second that,
Okay?
to remove it from that.
Well, we have to,
From the URA?
yeah, which obviously I'm into, but there has to be a second part
Wouldn't that
because
just
we're
go,
gonna have to
it would
read.
just go back in the general fund for right now, right?
Well, do you want the second part of the motion, or Mr. Mayor?
Yes. I think let's put it all together.
Okay.
If there is a second part, I suppose.
Well,
guess if
no,
you
I
know.
do have a second.
Okay,
You know, as I stated, I feel the program has benefited the community. What has not benefited the community has been the name calling, the claims of improprietary actions, cronyism, inappropriate, illegal, how many more were they? Actions. I think has negatively affected the reputation of council. And the trust of council. So the community good at this point of the program is tarnished. Even though it meets the public purpose, I think the community good of the grant program is tarnished to the point that if this council and the new council wants to work together in the future, that we eliminate the $85,000 from the budget, is my motion.
you're saying no longer continue the program?
Not to continue.
Okay,
And again, it's for the good of the council in the future to be able to work together. It's to ensure public trust in the council and eliminate the program in general.
okay.
I'll second.
So the motion was made by Councilman Nichols, seconded by Councilman Mazuka, to pull back the funding in the budget, the 85,000 from the URA board, but not only pull it back, but to also eliminate the small business grant program from the budget, the 2022 budget in its entirety. Does that sound accurate?
Accurate.
Okay. Liz, would you please poll the council?
Councilman Nichols?
A.
Councilman Cam?
Aye.
Councilman Hess?
Aye.
Councilman Cummings?
Nay.
Councilman James?
Aye.
Councilman Mazuka?
Aye.
Mayor Ogden?
Nay. Motion carries 5-2. Thank you. Thank you, council. Up next is item 6B, discussion and action to determine the EDC budget location for inclusion in the City of Craig's fiscal budget for 2022. Peter, do you have anything to add to this, or do we just start discussion?
I think we could just start discussion. Obviously, it's looking at whether we have the transparency of that budget or we incorporate it back into a P&L and with basically the same budget.
Got it.
Where are you saying? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Sorry.
There you go.
I said I believe where we're at on that particular item for the EDC budget is whether we continue to have that P&L out there for transparency and management purposes, or whether we incorporate that budget back into the administrative P&L. It was originally split between council and administration. So we'll probably propose, and Katie, you'll have to comment on this, but I think we'll propose putting it back into the administration budget. If that's the case, if you want to eliminate that, that page, that single page in the budget.
So, Peter, in those budget discussions, Councilman James brought up the fact that pursuant to the charter, it says that if it has a separate budget, that we have to create a department. But when I went back and looked at that, it says may, it does not say shall. So I'm just curious, like, is that technically something just based on history or whatever the case may be that we should actually create a department, or could it have a separate budget without that?
I think the may is giving you the ability to create a department, right? It doesn't say that you have to do it. It just says if it, and I'm kind of going off memory of the charter, but basically if it's going to be a department that is necessary for the city to function or something of that nature, then you can create a new department for that. I think you have to do that via ordinance. I don't think you can just create a department without an ordinance. The may just gives you the ability to do it. And if you look at it as the inverse, to abolish a department, you all would never abolish a department without an ordinance and a public hearing and everything else, right? So the may, it is kind of a tricky word in that situation. I can see where there's two different readings. My interpretation would be it just gives you the ability to do that, but I don't think it gives you the out to create a department absent an ordinance.
Okay. So when Peter and I spoke about it, so the museum, for example, we took over that building, we kind of took over that whole program from the county. We didn't create a separate department for that, but yet it really has its own separate budget. So, I mean, just curious, just trying to figure out how those two correlate.
Did we create a museum fund, though?
Yes, well, we probably had obviously we had a contract for the acquisition, and that was approved by ordinance, but I'm not sure that we had a standalone ordinance to create that P&L. But it did have its own reserves and funding and personnel. And so all those pieces went into that P&L, so we could track it from year to year.
So,
So if it's operating as its own department, which again, the museum, before my time, if it's operating as its own department, then should that have happened? Probably. But I don't know why it didn't. Perhaps it was a different reading of we don't have to do it because there's a may. But the way that I read that, it just gives you the ability to create or abolish a department, but it doesn't allow you the ability to create or abolish departments without an ordinance, a public hearing in that process.
Well, and there was probably oversight there because basically everyone in this community, for the most part, wanted that museum saved. So there was definitely a lot less scrutiny there.
Right.
So that probably avoided a lot of the conversation that we've had over this topic.
Nonetheless, it still should be handled the same, correct?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Well,
So, or could we, is that something that we could have under, like, under the purview of Parks and Rec?
The museum?
Yeah.
Well, sure. I mean, that could happen that way. You just couldn't, you couldn't see what the museum costs were from year to year.
I mean, you can, right? You can still look, the numbers are still there and they're the same.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, you just have to look.
We do that with the Yampa building. We set those costs off
Exactly.
Yeah.
from others. And we didn't create a department or create anything.
And I'm not sure that what is the definition of a department? I mean, is it by the mere creation of a P&L so you can see the expenses, the costs, the revenues? Is that the definition of a department?
I think if you label it Economic Development Department, it does become a department. I mean, on the facial reading of it, I think if it was called anything else, you're right, we wouldn't need to. But if it's called a department, I would think that you would align that with the charter saying create the department. I mean, if it was called the Economic Development Assistant or anything like that, and you're right, I don't think you'd have to form a department. You just put it in the budget as a standalone opposite of it. But the minute you call it department, it says we gotta create it by ordinance.
Well, we could change the nomenclature.
Right. That's a simple fix. Because that's all they want, that's what the public doesn't want us to do, is expand the number of departments we have. So just don't call it a department.
well,
Spend the money the same.
I'm a little lost how we got here. We're sitting in a budget workshop, and Ryan, Councilman Hess brought this up, that if we're gonna have Shannon's position, we needed to create a department. I don't think we called it Economic Development Department. Her title is Economic Development Manager, right? Correct, Peter?
Yes.
So here we go again with restricting, what we're planning to do. I personally don't care where she is on the P&L, the budget. I care that we have that position funded, and we have economic development funded for our future. Right now, it's more critical in this city's history than ever before. You created the controversy that we needed to fund this department. I don't particularly care, so I don't know how to make a motion on this.
I brought up the department because I don't want it to happen, and we would have to go through the ordinance. And
Well,
bring the public
we,
in.
nobody was talking the department until it was brought up, according to the charter.
What was in the budget as the Economic Development Department?
It was.
Was it department?
It was EDD.
Is it? I haven't,
I believe it was presented in the projected budget as Economic Development Department.
Yeah, I think that was the second budget meeting we had.
Right. And
It was, yeah, the second.
Yeah.
well, if, I don't see that nomenclature here, but is there an appropriate format that council would feel comfortable with in terms of changing the approach that we introduce it into the budget and still have visible tracking of the expenses in that department?
I think your intention, Peter, that day was that it has its own separate budget, so to speak, so that instead of being part of council's, just a slush fund that we just spend money on whatever we choose to, that, you can track those budgets specifically, and you've got, line items, you've got grant funding that comes in. So I think your intent was just that we could track that a little bit easier, kind of similar to what we're doing with the museum, correct?
That's right, because the head count was in my budget to begin with.
Right.
But the expenses and the capital projects were in the council budget. So in order to put that together, you'd have to, sit down and, Katie could do that, I'm sure.
Right.
I could do it too, but it would take me some time.
Some of the expenses too we're truly blended, you know? I mean, you have admin, operating expenses, like office supplies that were blended, so, and I probably said the word department, but the Yampa building has one of those on its own sheet as well. I mean, that was mentioned a few minutes ago. Like personnel costs, they would be all in one line, you know, for salaries, if it's in one department, like if it's in admin. So some transparency is lost with that if it's not separated out.
We agreed for the department for transparency, so it would be clear to the public to see. What does staff recommend? I don't know how to proceed on this.
Well, we could take the org chart and make sure that it doesn't have its own org chart. That could be incorporated into the administrative or organizational chart. Beyond that, remove any references that may show up someplace, as being a department. And my recommendation would be to keep the sheets so that we can see what they're spending.
I think for the greater good, I would ask council to please consider what staff's direction is. If we change the word department so that you guys can agree upon it and move on with life, I really don't see it as much different from the museum or the other places we have done over the last couple of years. I get that, I guess this grabbed more traction because of the negative connotation that's been around it for whatever reason. But another thing I want to ask this council to remember is that we are in kind of different economic uncertain times. And I think that this council, one of their, moving forward, one of the things you guys really should try to remember is that who better to lead economic development than the city? No one else really, besides the county, has helped and stepped up some that is going to lead this in this community for the future of this community, for the better of it. So I just want to say that I think taking that into consideration when you make a motion, I would ask to consider that, take staff's recommendation, to give it a page so that we can keep transparent about what's spent and what isn't. And if we're not comfortable calling it a department because we feel like we're growing government or whatever the negative connotation is, then fine. Call it something else. Call it whatever it needs to be called. But
Principle is still the same and the actions are also still the same.
so is the museum. And you didn't
Except
have a
that-
problem with that.
Right, but the museum isn't redistributing wealth.
Okay, well, we can debate that all day.
I'll make a motion to proceed forward on staff's recommendation of where they direct the expense to be noted in the budget for the most transparency to the public. Is that?
Okay, so a motion was made. I'm gonna try to get this right, Chris. If I don't, please just.
I'm not even sure why we're here. I think the only thing we did is piss off the community, excuse my language, and upset an employee having this whole
Right.
discussion.
Right, and cause division
So,
amongst council. I
From this
agree.
standpoint,
I think,
I will not repeat myself on the charter again, but I think people are trying to apply it so literal for their own agendas and not paying attention to the whole wording of the whole document. So, from that standpoint, my motion stands.
Okay, so I'm going to try to recap that.
Thank you.
So the motion was made by Councilman Nichols, seconded by Councilwoman Camp, to leave the EDC budget on its own page or location for the City of Craig's fiscal budget for 2022. Is that,
Right, for the most transparency for the public.
thank you for transparency purposes. Does that give you the direction you're looking for, Peter and Katie?
I would just say that as staff, I'm not going to fall on my sword on this item. It's kind of a minute thing. We can figure it out either way, but we'd prefer a way to look at it.
Admin.
Okay. Okay, so there's a motion on the table. Liz, I would ask you to pull the council, please.
Repeat the motion.
I'm sorry, yep.
Please.
So the motion on the table is, if I'm saying this correctly, to leave EDC's budget location on its own page, its own standing, for the purposes of the City of Craig's fiscal budget for 2022, for transparency purposes, for tracking purposes.
Thank you.
Does that, I think, okay, thank you. Liz, would you please pull the council?
Need a second?
I got him. Councilwoman Camp did that. Sorry. Liz? Yeah, I think.
Councilman Nichols?
Aye.
Councilwoman Camp?
Aye.
Councilman Hess?
Aye.
Councilman Cummings?
Aye.
Councilman James?
Nay.
Councilman Mazuka?
Aye.
Mayor Ogden?
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you, council. All that's left now is a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Okay? Motion was made by Councilman James, seconded by Councilman Mazuka. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Buying the beer now.